Hello, in this video I'm going to be looking at the Somua SM. So this tank is one of the Snowglobe rewards that you can get at the moment, and it's more one of the more uninteresting sort of meh rewards that you wouldn't be too excited to get unless you had some sort of odd obsession with the Somua SM. And the reason for that is because this tank just offers nothing unique or special and is fairly frustrating to play due to its poor gun. And the reason for this is, back in testing, the Somua had crazy damage output, a 2.4 second intraclip reload with the same reload time as an Emil 1951, which is 20.9 seconds. But then Wargaming, seeing that was too strong, decided to nerf it. However, they didn't just nerf one of these two aspects, intraclip reload or magazine reload, they decided to nerf both very significantly, nerfing the intraclip from 2.4 seconds up to 3, which, if you know tier 8, you'll know it's the same as every single one of these other autoloaders. And then the magazine reload going from 20.9 up to 23, which is insanely long. In fact, it's longer than the IS-3 Defender. So, despite this, it does have quite a nice combination of good armor and good mobility. However, the gun, unfortunately, is just quite bad. But the good armor and mobility is what makes this tank still a fairly good vehicle. It does perform fairly well on win rate. So, if you did get this tank from the Snowglobe, you do have a good tank. Unfortunately, it's not too fun or enjoyable to play, just because the gun is what you really feel in battle. It's what you notice the most. But of course, let's get into the stats. There is a review on my website if you want to check it out without this commentary. So the Somua SM. Here we can see its armor. You can notice its upper plate is very red, which is quite nice for a French tank, which generally they are quite lightly armored for the heavies. You can see that the upper plate being fully red, it is 255 to 270 millimeters thick, slightly stronger than a Tiger II, which it is quite comparable to in its angle and thickness. However, you can notice the lower plate is terrible, 120 millimeters thick, means even the lowest penetration tier 7 tanks will be able to go through, even when you angle the hull. Next, you can notice the turret. Immediately, you can see its cupola is absolutely insanely massive, and it is very easy to hit. Other than this, you can notice around the gun, there are some areas which you can go through because the gun, the areas around the gun are only 200 millimeters thick, which is not great for tier 8. However, overall the turret protection is okay, as long as the hatch wasn't there, which unfortunately it is. You can see when you turn the hull, of course, it is very good for angling because the Somua has a conventional hull armor layout, unlike the other French tanks which have a sort of shoulder, which you can see here on the AMX 50-100. It's got that sort of angled hull shoulder there. The Somua doesn't have that, allowing you to angle and side scrape. Unfortunately, the track wheel is fairly weak, so if you shot it here, like in this current situation with 225 AP, it will penetrate through. However, you can still side scrape given that the wall or the obstacle you side scrape against is at sort of this angle, making the front track wheel quite hard to hit. It means that enemies will still bounce off this area over here. But you can see turning the turret quite poor, of course, because the turret is rounded, and of course because it relies on you to sort of face it forward because it does taper in towards the gun slightly. Next, switching to premium ammo, you can see that the upper plate goes, well, penetrable, but you can see there is still slight red, which is actually very good for tier 8, considering a tank with similar protection, the Tiger II, just goes full grey when the hull is turned. However, also similar to the Tiger II, you can angle the hull, as shown here, and it will be very strong even against some of the highest penetration in tier 8, which is something very nice. This hull is both thick and angled, which allows you to do that. But you can notice the turret protection is now very poor, with the main issue still being, of course, the cupola, but the areas around the gun have become weaker as well. Using gun depression, you can see, again, big issue is the cupola. If that wasn't there, its gun depression protection would actually be really nice. But the cupola is there, so it's not reliable at all when hull down, just because enemies see that cupola and they go for it. Also against premium ammo, you can notice that the areas around the gun, again, become a bit weaker. Now, something you can do is raise the gun to sort of slightly hide the cupola, or you could turn the turret, such as in this image, to try and put your gun in the way. However, it is worth noting, don't raise your gun all the way up. After a certain point, it isn't worth doing, and I'll show that here. So this is facing 283mm of heat penetration. On flat ground, you can see that, of course, the turret front is penetrable. Raising the gun does actually benefit you, so you can see here how it becomes now very red on those turret cheek areas. However, that's as far as you should raise it. It shouldn't go any further, just because after this point it doesn't add much benefit to the turret, and it gives a massive weak point underneath the gun for enemies to go for. So just raise it slightly. Don't raise it all the way because it's not worth it, and you can put your gun in the way of the cupola. That does also help, especially if enemies don't know really that AP can still penetrate through a gun. They might try and go for the areas, other areas of the turret, which means they can bounce off or miss, of course. So next, moving to the gun, this tank has a 100mm autoloader. It does 310 damage on AP, 260 on APCR, and 350 on HE. So AP and APCR damage is completely normal, however HE is that typical French 100mm HE, doing a terrible increase of 40 damage, which really isn't at all good, and it means you can only use this HE against sort of shots which you are 100% sure they are going to penetrate and do full damage. For example, against a Scorpion G, or the side or rear of a Su-130 PM. I'd say don't use this against tanks that might have spall liner, for example, Rheinmetall Borsig Waffenträger. That, if you use this against that, your HE would do less damage than AP. But 3 shells in the magazine, with 3-second entry clip, doing 930 in 6 seconds. Completely normal for an autoloader of this type at this tier. Reload time is 23.2 with 1880 DPM. Now that reload time, that is really quite bad, and I'll show you why that is here. So Somua SM having, I'll say I'm going to use vents on this tank just because its reload is slow, 1929 DPM with a 22.9 second reload. For the sake of simplicity, let's say 23 seconds. So the next highest DPM up from this is the Carnarvon Defender with a very low DPM of 1945, but note, on this tank I am not using calibrated shells and it still has higher DPM than the Somua. Another important thing to note, my reload is a whole 3 seconds faster at basically 20 rather than the Somua's 23. So despite this tank not having that much more DPM, its reload time is significantly faster, giving you more opportunities and flexibility in battle. Of course, remember the Carnarvon Defender does less alpha damage, hence why its DPM isn't high. Next, going up from the Carnarvon Defender, Emil 1, again a tank that can't use vents because of its terrible penetration, but you can see almost 23 second reload, however its DPM is a lot higher at 2021. Again, this will be due to better alpha damage on the gun compared to the Somua. and it still has a slightly faster reload, giving it a bit more flexibility in battle. Next, Emil 1951. This tank can use vents because it has amazing penetration, 2100 DPM almost, with a 20.6 second reload. Again, significantly faster reload time with a significantly far better DPM. And then, of course, the Yo and the Scepter, both of these have to use calibrated because of their low penetration. 20.8 second reload, again, roughly 2 seconds faster than the Somua, and 2100 DPM, a lot more DPM. And of course, the 5100, which is a bit of an outlier with its under 18 second reload and 2350 DPM. So, between these autoloaders, all having the same 3 second intro clip, all having the same 310 alpha except the Carnarvon and the Emil 1, but you can see out of all of these, the Somua still has the worst DPM, still has a significantly longer reload than all of these tanks except the Emil, which has better alpha damage. So just to put into perspective how bad the DPM of the Somua is. And to note, that reload is slightly worse than an IS-3 Defender. But other than this, penetration 232, that is actually very good. It's above average for tier 8. 263 on APCR, that is also good. Fairly average for tier 8, and then 50 on HE, which is normal for a 100mm gun. Aim time of 4.4 or 4.8 seconds is completely terrible. It is really bad for this type of gun. Actually, that is not right. That should have been deleted a while ago. Its aim time is 4.4 or 4.7 seconds, but still really bad for this type of gun, especially if you compare it to the Emil 1, which also has quite slow aim time, 4 and 4.3, significantly better than the Somua. Base aim time of 2.6. Again, that is terrible. It is really bad for 310 alpha damage. And the best you can get it down to is 2, which again is not good for 310 alpha damage. Dispersion 0.344 is normal for this gun at this tier. And then gun handling of 0.22, 0.22, 0.16. That is definitely below average. That's worse than average. Especially for a gun with 310 alpha damage. There are some guns which have such bad gun handling, but generally they make up for it with better base aim time or dispersion. For example, a AMX M449, and then 10 degrees of gun depression, which is very nice. However, for this class of tank, it's nothing impressive. So, to recap, what's good on this gun? Penetration is pretty good. Nothing else. Alpha damage is normal, but its HE is kind of bad. And that's it, really. Bad DPM, terrible reload, terrible aim time, terrible gun handling, well, quite bad gun handling, and okay gun depression, but nothing special for the type of tank that this is. And I'll show that in a minute. Next, top speed 40, very good. 18 in reverse, also very good. Traverse speed 35, that's quite good. And 30, that's fairly average. On medium terrain, acceleration rate is 16.4 in game with an almost 1150 horsepower engine, the tank weighing a very heavy 70 tons. And 13.7 is its actual acceleration on hard terrain, and 11.7 on medium. So this mobility is actually very good. It actually feels quite impressive, quite mobile for having as much hull armor as it has, having as much weight as it has. It does actually feel like a fairly mobile tank. I'd compare it to an Emil 1951 sort of mobility. So its mobility is actually good. Quickly, let's compare it to, well, actually, let me just do the equipment first. So, how I would equip this tank is using vents, you might say, but it's got great penetration. You can use calibrated shells. You'll sort of offset the aim time, which is very bad on this tank. Yes, that is true. You can use calibrated shells to offset the aim time, but for me personally, I just feel after playing this tank a fair bit, its reload is so bad. I would rather have improved ventilation, just because not using it takes your reload up to 23.7 seconds, which is insanely bad. And it's just really hard to be able to use that against other tanks that you face in battle and to be able to respond to situations. On top of this, of course, vents also slightly improves your accuracy and your aim time, and of course also your mobility very slightly. Next, optics, of course, because this is a heavy tank, and you can see even with the improved ventilation, this tank doesn't have great view range, only 268 on with optics equipped. Next, engine accelerator. Improved control could also work, but in most situations the traverse speed is enough, and having a better acceleration rate will be nice, just to get over more uneven terrain. Enhanced armor, improved assembly can also work, just because tanks penetrate through your upper plate and, well, not your upper plate, but your turret fairly often. However, for me, I'm going with enhanced armor just to force enemies to aim. For example, in some situations, enemies will be able to load premium ammo and go through the upper plate, but if you use enhanced armor, they won't be able to do that, which forces them to take a bit of extra time to either aim for your turret weak points or your lower plate, which I believe is actually a fairly helpful thing, just because you also have terrible aim time and a terrible reload, so buying yourself extra time against enemies is actually quite useful. So, gun lane drive, of course, as this tank has abysmal base aim time for a 310 alpha gun. You can see it improves it by 0.6 effective, which is actually a ton for such a low alpha gun. So definitely use enhanced gun lane drive, especially as this tank doesn't have bad shell velocity at all. And next, vertical stabilizer. Again, for me personally, this is the better choice, just because this tank's dispersion is actually fairly alright at 0.344. That's fairly normal for a 310 alpha gun in tier 8. Not the best, but it's not terrible. I'm using vertical stabilizer just because your gun handling is actually pretty bad, and your aim time, as said just now, is terrible for 310 alpha, so using vertical stabilizer. And then with a consumable delivery system, it doesn't really matter, but you don't have any consumable to sort of make longer duration other than the speed boost, so use consumable delivery system since it benefits everything. But yeah, that is equipment. And by the way, this tank doesn't have any special consumables or provisions. But let's get to a sort of comparison of this tank. Let's talk about why this tank isn't special at all, why it doesn't do anything really. So, having seen the capabilities of the tank, we know it has good armor, it has good mobility, and it has a terrible gun. So we can sort of compare it to the autoloaders we have in tier 8. So let's look at each of them and sort of compare their capabilities, just because it's sort of useful to see if this tank has any place in tier 8. So, Somua SM with its good mobility, good armor, but terrible gun. AMX 5100, bad hull armor, great turret armor, in fact better than the Somua SM, and you can see its cupola is smaller. Amazing mobility for a heavy tank, and amazing gun, the best autoloader in tier 8 for a heavy tank. So this is the sort of agile, heavier vehicle with a great gun. Next, Emil 1951, also fairly lightly armoured. However, its armour isn't terrible, and when using its full gun depression, its turret goes up to 290mm. Very effective even against tier 9 tanks. On top of this, it's got great mobility, not quite as good as the AMX 5100, but as good if not better than the Somua. And then it's got a great gun. Its aim time still isn't great, but it's got great gun handling, it's got the same dispersion as a Somua, and it's got even better penetration than a Somua on its premium rounds with a great 270 AP. And this tank can use vents or calibrated shells just because its gun isn't nearly as bad as the Somua. So, slightly less armoured than Somua, but with better gun and mobility, and it still has decent armour. Emil 1. This tank by far has the most comparable armour to the Somua. Very strong on the upper plate, very strong on the turret, much better than the Somua on the turret. Its gun is more similar to the Somua, being worse handling than the Emil and the AMX, with poor penetration, forcing it to use calibrated shells, and also a long reload. However, its gun is still a lot better than the Somua, but it does just trade out on mobility. So this one, the less mobile, more armoured version. Carnarvon Defender. Of course, this tank has great frontal armour like a Somua, with weak points on the lower plate and the turret front when you use premium ammo. It's also slow but quite mobile and has an accurate gun, so the slower version of the Somua. Other than that, very similar. And then of course the Yos, which are rather different, with a strong turret, poor hull armour, and a great gun. Fairly similar to the MX-5100 actually, just a bit slower. But basically, what's the purpose of the Somua? If you want armour, you can get yourself an Emil 1 or a Carnarvon Defender. People don't think much of the Carnarvon Defender, but it's actually not terrible. If you want mobility, you can go with the AMX-5100. It's got a great gun to go with it as well. Or the Emil 1951. This tank still doesn't have terrible armour, but it has that great mobility. If you want a great gun, go for the Scepter, the M3 Yo, or the AMX-5100. In fact, or an Emil 1951 or a Carnarvon. There's just not much point to the Somua. It doesn't specialise in anything, and it trades out a lot of its DPM and gun handling just for what? Armour, which the Emil 1 does better, mobility, which the Emil 1951 and 5100 do better. What's the point of playing a Somua? And you'll even see with its armour profile that it's nothing too amazing. So you can see here, this is against a Rev using calibrated shells. Bit unfair comparison because it's got calibrated shells on, but you can see sort of the issue of the tank. Even if you're angling the hull in the optimal way, even if you're using full gun depression, you can see the turret just has a massive cupola, which is bad. AMX 5100, this tank is paper, but you can see that despite that, its turret armor is better than the Somua just because it's got a smaller cupola, and though it has less gun depression, even when using that gun depression, it's better than the Somua. Again, Carnarvon Defender, you can notice immediately the cupola is not a weak point hardly, and other than the cupola, the turret front is fairly strong. Of course, it's penetrable to premium ammo, but then of course the Somua is as well. And then of course, when using gun depression, the hull, no problem at all, going through the turret still. But the hull is very strong, just like a Somua. And then Emil, another premium. Again, this tank, slightly less armoured on flat ground, but using the full gun depression, suddenly you have almost tier 9 levels of armour on the turret, up to 300mm. So just why play the Somua really? That's not the Somua, that's the AMX. Why play the Somua? So let's get into the gameplay. Having to re-record this section because it was too quiet on the original recording and you couldn't hear what I was saying. But the first game is on Lagoon. In this battle, it doesn't show too much the poor accuracy of the tank. However, I'm hoping it does show a sort of poor reload of this vehicle, which is quite evident in gameplay. So here you'll see going to the middle, which is a fairly common thing that happens on this map nowadays with the heavy tanks. One thing important to note in this battle is that all the fights are fairly close quarters, so the accuracy of this tank isn't so noticeable, and that's where this tank will work well, where it can sort of ignore the fact it has terrible accuracy, which is a close range sort of fight. So here, seeing that there's no tanks on this side, are going to push forward against the WZ-121 FT and his platoon mate. Also notice this tank's mobility, it is fairly good, fairly quick for a heavy tank, it was get around quite easily. There was a nice snapshot which really most tanks would hit, that was just a bad shot by me, I believe. And then another shot which is fairly lucky for this tank especially. But now notice the reload, I'll be reloading for ages, and there are tanks which I can shoot, which in any other vehicle, any other autoloader in tier 8, you would have a better chance of dealing with those tanks just because you don't reload for 23 seconds. So here you'll see the tank's poor accuracy letting it down there. Of course, a bit unlucky as well, however, with this tank especially, you can blame the accuracy because it is quite bad in terms of its aim time and handling. However, again, you can see just a long reload, which is just so crippling to this tank. If you miss a shot, of course, it's even worse. So in this situation, I'm wondering whether to go for Skoda or not. And he comes back around, and I'm sort of debating whether to go for him or not. And then I decide instead I'll go for other enemies. There I make a bit of a rushed shot just because the Predator was going back into cover and I wanted to try and shut him down. But unfortunately, not enough gun elevation there. Not a fault of the gun, but just impatience on my part. But again, look at the accuracy there against the Annihilator, just missing a shot right over the top of that tank. There I do get quite a nice shot on the Predator's cupola, but it was fully aimed, which, you know, not impressive. This tank's accuracy is the same as, for example, an Emil 1 when it is fully aimed, so nothing that other tanks couldn't have pulled off. And here again, notice I'm still not reloaded against this Annihilator. It's been taking ages. Now finally I'm able to push forward and finish off this Annihilator. Now notice this shot on the WZ. You can see the reticle on his tank. It is mostly on his vehicle. It would be hard to miss. But oh, this is the Somua SM, and it goes right over. So yeah, you can sort of see what's going on with this gun. Slow reloading, missing quite a lot, and slow aiming as well. So here against this Scorpion, I'm going to try using HE. One thing to note is that the HE on this tank isn't very good. Only having 350 alpha, which is only a 40 damage increase, which against the majority of enemies is not worth using. But considering that the Scorpion doesn't have spore line and I can easily penetrate him, I did use the HE there. So that game, almost 3000 damage dealt, which is not terrible considering this tank doesn't even have 2000 DPM, and doing 1100 blocked. It does make okay credits. Again, this is a premium and this tank has good penetration, so it won't need to be spamming premium ammo, which is something fairly nice, but you have to consider you could do that in an Emil 1951, which has better penetration than the Somua, at least on premium ammo, and basically the same on standard ammo. But this battle on Yamato Harbour, it is again fairly close quarters, so in this battle the accuracy really doesn't come into play at all. It's all just close quarters fights, but again you'll notice the reload, because in a close quarters fight reload is more important than anything, because the pressure is there because the enemies are right in front of you. But in this game I'm alone with the IS-2SH pushing forward. I'm a bit worried what the other enemy heavy tanks are doing. So I'm sort of calling for my heavy tanks to come and push forward. So here against the T-34 I'm able to get in a shot, I believe. Got one on the IS-2SH and then one on the T-34. I'm going to wait for him since it seems like he wants to try and side scrape, and I know that I can go through his tracks if I hit them, but I don't hit them, and I ricochet off the side. So here, again, reloading, so I'm going to try and make use of this time where I'm not loaded and reposition to flank those heavy tanks up there. It seems like my allies won't be surviving too long, so I'm going to try and focus down the low health enemies so we can be more even on the number of guns. So here, using the 70-ton weight to ram the IS-2SH, unfortunately doesn't do anything. 30 damage, great, really coming in useful there. But now unfortunately I do take 3 shots from the Emil 1, which puts me down to a 1 shot for that T-34, and 1 clippable once the Emil reloads. So I'm going to try and go after this LT, but again, notice still reloading here, bit unfortunate. Notice he has 1070 something hit points, so I do get a bit lucky, max rolling there, putting in a slight low roll there, and then a very high roll there. So I do get a bit lucky shutting down that LT-432. But again, the reload, be reloading for ages in this tank. And one other thing to notice in this vehicle, you may think, oh, it's only 3 seconds. 3 seconds does make a big difference in these sort of fights. You also have to consider that 3 seconds is worse on top of also having worse accuracy, worse aim time, worse dispersion on movement. And compared to an M3Yo, worse intraclip reload, since that has 2.73. But again, okay score, 2,864 damage. The 70-ton weight really coming in useful there, doing 27 ram damage and not managing to kill that IS-2SH, which is great. 106,000 credits, again, it makes pretty good credits considering it's a tier 8 premium. But you have to consider, in those battles, what was the point of playing a Somua SM? I could have played an Emil 1 to have the same sort of actually better armor performance with better gun performance as well. I could have played an Emil 1951. It's got worse armor performance on flat ground, but it's much better at being a hull down tank, and it's got the same sort of mobility with a much better gun. Could have played a Scepter. Again, it's got better armor when it's hull down. Worse on flat ground, again, but its gun is better in just all situations. And of course, if you just want purely a great gun, great mobility, and pretty good turret armor, you can go with an AMX 50-100. What's the point of this tank? It's got some armor, but it's got a lot of weak points, it's got a terrible gun, and while its mobility is good, it's not like it's the best, or it's not like it's even special, because the Emil 1951 exists, and in all fairness, the Emil 1 with its consumable can also still compete with this. So why would you play this tank? It's not a bad tank overall, it's just pointless and quite frustrating to play. So unfortunately for you, if you won this in a Snowglobe, sort of meh reward, but it's an okay tank. It's still not terrible. But yeah, that's the Somua SM. Thanks for watching.